China is waging a Cold War against the West, and the West isn't prepared. What can be done to turn the situation around? Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. For years, the Chinese Communist Party has been slowly expanding its power and reach. Countries in close proximity like Australia and New Zealand were testing grounds for tactics the party would use to influence and undermine their biggest enemy, the United States. The Chinese Communist Party has insidiously twisted Western democratic institutions into becoming extensions of their will. That includes co-opting governments, companies, and academic institutions. Here's what the FBI director said recently.
The greatest long-term threat to our nation's information and intellectual property and to our economic vitality is the counterintelligence and economic espionage threat from China.
Essentially, China is in a Cold War with the West. And now there's a new book coming out about it. It's called Hidden Hand, exposing how the Chinese Communist Party is reshaping the world. One of the co-authors is Mareike Olberg, a senior fellow in the Asia program of the German Marshall Fund. Ms. Olberg joins me from Berlin to talk about the book and what she and her co-author discovered. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So in your upcoming book, Hidden Hand, you write that while the CCP and its supporters in the West like to speak of a new Cold War being waged against China, for the CCP, the Cold War never ended. So, are they stuck at the end of the 1980s with mullets and leg warmers? What's going on?
So the point that we're trying to make with that paragraph really is, if you're listening to the current conversation on China, you will always have people who chime in saying, look, if we're going to treat China as an enemy, China is going to become the enemy, and we need, have constructive dialogue, et cetera, et cetera. And my response to that always is, look, I'm not against constructive dialogue. The problem is that you're dealing with a party, the CCP, that has had this Cold War thinking of friends and enemies ingrained in its thinking, basically since forever, but most importantly, since it cracked down on the democracy movement in 1989, and then found itself in a world where it was surrounded by, what it thought of as hostile forces. So if you're going to make the argument that if we treat China, quote unquote, as an enemy, then it's going to become our enemy, what are you going to make of the fact that, the CCP has been treating the West, Western countries, anybody who basically opposes what it stands for, as hostile forces for the past 30 years, and increasingly so since Xi Jinping came to power? So the point we're trying to make here really is, you can't have dialogue with only one side. You need to have two sides. And on the side of the CCP, that dialogue partner is missing. And this is something that politicians in the West simply need to realize.
So like when China talks about cooperation, what they really mean is do what we say.
The problem really is the CCP has become really good at adopting the vocabulary that politicians in the West like to hear. Obviously, they have absorbed concepts like democracy and human rights, where even when they use that, even Western politicians are a bit cynical about it. But they're really good at playing up this language of cooperation, win-win cooperation, of saying, China is a responsible big power. We're all in favor of multilateralism. So they're really good at picking up that vocabulary, but the problem is it's defined quite differently. And no, China is not a force for multilateralism. That is not in its interests. But somehow they have succeeded really well in pretending that they are a force for multilateralism, that they can become this great responsible power by simply repeating those words that politicians in the West like to hear. And we need to look more closely at what the interests of the CCP actually are before we take them at face value when they repeat phrases.
Well, the West successfully won the Cold War against the Soviet Union, so why has it been so unprepared for the Cold War with China?
Frankly, I'm always a little bit cynical about this whole idea of engagement, and I've always been wondering, has this whole engagement line always been a bit of a pretext to be able to continue to do business with an authoritarian regime? But then I speak to people and they tell me, look, based on what we have experienced in the Cold War, we here in Western Europe or in North America had reason to believe that this would work with China as well. And I'm thinking, okay, maybe you're right. Maybe if you don't read Chinese sources, if you don't look at what the party has been saying, you can think that. The problem really is that politicians have been ignoring the things that the CCP has been writing in Chinese, but even sometimes in English. It's been putting out there and has simply been saying that, we're going to do our thing. And it's completely disregarded that the other side also has agency and also makes plans. And if you're thinking you can repeat something that you did successfully in the Cold War and the other side's just going to watch it and put up with it, then maybe the other side has a strategy too. And that understanding is only now beginning to sink in.
Well, so what is the Communist Party's goal when it comes to the United States?
The big idea here is in the 1990s, the CCP found itself, in what itself thought surrounded by hostile forces. It was one of the few communist parties left in the world. It is a party that is not elected, so it has that general uneasiness that I think any unelected official has, who knows that when they leave power, they're not just going to be leaving power by the ballot box and can then retire to their home. They are really threatened by some of the ideas that are floating around, such as, Chinese people deserve democracy. Chinese people deserve a system where there's separation of powers. So in the early 1990s, the initial idea was, if we put up barriers and we make sure that, we keep out certain ideas out of China, and we make sure that our citizens have enough patriotic education so that they can support the party, et cetera, we are okay. So that was the initial plan. It's like a defensive strategy of putting up the great firewall of China as the internet opened up and making sure those ideas don't come in. But I think the long-term calculation here is it's bad for us as the Communist Party of China to constantly battle ideas coming in, to constantly deal with a world where the United States has allies, but we don't have allies, where we're surrounded by the alliance systems of the United States and where the overall public opinion environment is hostile to us. So in order to be able to stay in power in the long run, we need to change not what is happening in China and not put up barriers, but we need to change the international environment that we are based in to make sure it becomes safer for us, the Chinese Communist Party, to stay in power in the long run. And that involves anything on what is known as the public opinion front, in the public opinion environment. So to make sure that not only people in China think that the CCP and its regime is the best possible political model for China, but that internationally there is agreement as well, that there will be lots of international politicians coming in saying, you know what, the model that the CCP has set up really is a good model for the 21st century, and that they recognize that. So that is one end on the public opinion front, quote unquote. But the other really is also to realign countries' interests, to break up the many alliances that the United States has around the world, and to do so gradually, basically by offering, I guess, what they frame as non-competing models. So the idea is, you can be in alliance with the United States, but then you can also be in this alternative informal alliance with China, and the two are not competing. But of course, the interests of the United States allies are shifted in a way. So with the hope on the CCP side that those countries will be moved to first a place where in a conflict between the United States and China, those countries will stay neutral. And then eventually, in the long run, they may actually start siding with China. And that's just a gradual chipping away at the alliance system as it exists in order to make sure that the CCP, not just at home, but internationally, encounters an environment that is more conducive to it staying in power in the long run.
Well, that's why such a big part of this new Cold War is a propaganda war. And so in your book, one of the many tactics the party uses you call double hatting and double platting. What are those?
So the whole idea is in the Chinese system, and this is also domestically so, for reasons that have to do with the way that the whole system is set up, people usually wear several hats. Meaning, if they have a certain position, their organization or they themselves may act under different names. For instance, they may be wearing their party hat if they're engaging with other party organizations, whereas when they're engaging with the state apparatus, they're going to wear their state hat. or when internationally it's important that someone be perceived as a more independent voice, they may be wearing an NGO hat or a commercial hat. So the idea is you have different names for what is essentially the same organization. The term for that is one organization with two nameplates or several nameplates, really. And it's very common. And not all of this is a sinister scheme to deceive foreigners, because it really does have a function within the Chinese domestic system itself. But of course, when Chinese organizations, party organizations go out into the world to interact with people, it is a lot more helpful if they can wear their commercial hat and act as a company, or they can wear their NGO hat and act as an organization that, at least to foreigners, looks like it's a civil society organization, than to come out and say, yeah, we're an organization that is directly under the leadership of the Communist Party of China, and we listen to the party. Those connections aren't necessarily hidden. Like if you go and search who the China International Publishing Group is, you will find out that no, there's really an underlying party state organization that just uses this name on the international stage. But it's not something that your typical foreigner that gets in touch with these organizations is necessarily going to do. They're going to, think China International Publishing Group, great, it's a commercial publisher perhaps, without really checking that no, this is actually a party state organization that ultimately falls under the Office of External Propaganda of the CCP. And this is just one of many examples, and basically a lot of the organizations that do exchange internationally under a different nameplate than they would within the system in China.
And so what is double platting? Is that the same thing?
Yes, so double hatting basically just refers to the individuals wearing their different hats in their different capacities. And double platting, that's basically the nameplate of the organization itself that it acts under. So one organization with two nameplates or with three nameplates, that's what that refers to.
So it's basically a way to cover up the fact that at the end of the day, it's the Chinese Communist Party that controls everything.
On the international stage, absolutely. Again, like I said, this has evolved in a way that it also serves other uses so that they can act in different capacities, but it's come in incredibly handy, I think, when interacting with foreigners. And in some cases, you will have Communist Party officials instructing their media, for instance, to say, look, when you interact with, when you do exchange with foreigners, make sure that you use your commercial nameplate, because that'll be easier for you than when you wear your party hat. So it's definitely, they're aware that this can be used strategically, and people are instructed to do that, yes.
Well, you also talk about the 5% rule, that the CCP frames international criticism of it as being from only a small minority with ulterior motives. So what's an example of this?
So you can see this basically almost any statement that the CCP puts out. You will find this idea of the small minority. You can see this when the CCP talks about the protests in Hong Kong. It'll always say, look, the overwhelming majority of people in Hong Kong really want stability, and they want this new national security law. It is only a tiny minority of fringe radicals that are violent and possibly instigated by foreigners that are against this. This is the same framing everywhere. It's a way of taking away people's agency by saying most people just move along, and most people are automatically on the side of the CCP. Because the idea from the party's perspective is the party is good. And since the majority of people are good, the majority of people always have to be on the side of the party. And you will only ever have them come forward and say there's a small number of evildoers that have ulterior motives, usually some hostile forces in the West, plus some people, some organizing forces like the Dalai Lama, like the World Uyghur Congress, like some other people that are the troublemakers. And those are the quote unquote enemies in the thinking of the party that need to be basically destroyed, discredited wherever the party can. This also has, I guess, like tactical advantages, because you can basically say, look, you saw this during the Tiananmen protests. It's like most of you were protesting, but you were really just misled. This was orchestrated by a small number of hostile forces. You were misled, so you are forgiven. So it's also a way of reintegrating people back into the arms of the party in a way, to say you were really just being misguided by those hostile forces, but your intentions weren't bad. You had problems in your thinking. Really, you can see this in all areas where the party makes any statements. You saw it at Tiananmen, you see it with the Hong Kong protests. You can see it on the international stage, where the idea that, the Philippines, for bringing a case against China in The Hague, it could not have possibly been the agency of the Philippines, but must have been instigated by the United States. You can see it at all levels, in domestic politics, in any kind of civil society engagement. In China itself, the party always looks for the couple of bad instigators that it can then isolate from the rest of the group, while simultaneously extending a hand to the rest of the people who are not the enemy of the people, and reintegrate them into the system under the party. That's basically the united front logic of the party, to divide people into, the firm friends of the party. Then you have a large middle ground, and then you have a small number of enemies that you need to fight. That's the underlying logic that really plays out in all fields wherever you look.
Well, so the Communist Party obviously has a lot of different propaganda tactics. One of my personal favorites is whenever they say they're the victim of whatever they're currently being accused of. So cyber attacks are a good example. Did you know the party is a victim of cyber attacks?
I'm sure they are. I mean, everybody these days, everybody occasionally gets attacked. But this is a classic. And I think the Chinese government and the CCP really takes tit for tat. It turns it into an art. It's basically someone says, you're doing this to us, and then their ultimate response, their most common response, is always going to be, no, we're not. And by the way, you are doing this to us. This tit for tat arguing, just like, when the United States started issuing a human rights report for China, of course, the Chinese government had to come out and issue one for the United States as well, which, by the way, often draws on the research done by United States human rights organizations. So they're really taking the research that is done by people in the United States and are using it for their own report, which, all the power to them. If they could do their own research, that would be even better. But this whole idea of you say something bad, I'll just turn it around to you. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party is not the only entity that does this. I'm also not sure that they're necessarily doing themselves a favor with this, because it is quite obvious. But then again, I'm not an expert on how these things are received internationally. So maybe there's some advantage to them of doing this that I simply don't see.
Well, so that's my question. It's like, do they really think this is convincing?
It's kind of hard to say. With a lot of the propaganda that the CCP puts out, I'm always torn. On the one hand, I think in part it doesn't matter whether it's convincing or not, especially when it does get more aggressive, because especially the more aggressive posturing, I think, often is directed at their own bosses back in Beijing. So as long as they're convinced, their own bosses are convinced it's a good thing for the people putting out this kind of propaganda. On the other hand, I feel like we also shouldn't underestimate how much some of this rhetoric resonates with people who may be thinking, okay, I am generally uncomfortable with what Western countries are doing in the world, and I'm a big critic of my own country, but I don't know a great deal about China. So I think especially in that camp of people who want to be critical of what the United States does and what Western Europe does. And you know what? I mean, there are plenty of reasons to be critical of what the United States does or what Western European countries do. But the idea here is these people may see that and think, okay, I'm critical of my own government, but they also don't know that much about the CCP. So I don't know, again, how many people actually may be convinced, mainly because there is, until this day, even though we now talk more about China, there is a big gap of knowledge about China in general, about Chinese society, but also about the political system, about the things that the party does. So again, when the CCP is talking to people who don't know a great deal about China, I am not so sure whether we should simply dismiss everything that the party says as, well, nobody's going to believe that. Because if you don't know anything and you come into this and you don't know much about China, but you do feel slightly uneasy about your own country, about your own Western country, then maybe there is something in there for you that you can connect with. And I do think we simply need more research in some areas of how these kinds of messages are received.
So this month, the FBI said China is the greatest long-term threat to the U.S., and the FBI said they have to open a new China-related counterintelligence case about every 10 hours. So is China winning?
Not necessarily. I wouldn't say that China is winning because the FBI opens up new China cases every 10 hours. And to some degree, I do think once you start digging in a certain area, you find more of what you're looking for. So I do think part of that is reflecting that. On the other hand, I don't think the fact that people are now becoming more aware of a lot of what's going on necessarily, I mean, that's a good thing that people become more aware of what is going on. I am slightly concerned, as always, with when, intelligence organizations start looking into something that they start overshooting the mark. So I'm generally concerned about that. So I'm a little apprehensive about the FBI going after everybody and their grandmother. But then again, I do think China is very active in this sphere. It's very good that intelligence organizations, not just in the United States, but in Australia, in Europe, we've had several cases here in Germany recently, start paying attention and start acting against the more obvious cases of Chinese intelligence trying to win people over in this side of the world. I think this has been ongoing for a very long time. I think it's a real problem, and it's good and not necessarily a sign that China or the Chinese Communist Party is winning, that people are now starting to react more strongly to that. Always with the caveat in mind that, there is always going to be a risk of overshooting the mark.
Well, so you mentioned this knowledge gap. It seems like that's really going to be the key in the Western world really being able to come out on top of this Cold War with China.
Yeah, I mean, really our biggest problem among many is the fact that we don't know a great deal about China. We don't know much about the party that's in power. We don't know about the political system. And that really makes it incredibly easy for people to ignore the fact that there is a government, there is a party that has agency, that makes its own plans, that those are plans which some of them you can't know, but a lot of them you can know. And it's a matter of systematic, fundamental change of making sure that, there have to be more people who learn Chinese, who speak Chinese, who read it fluently, who can analyze these documents, who have the knowledge about the system in the background. And of course, one of the bigger problems in the past 10 to 20 years has been that really governments have been cutting back on funding for Chinese studies, at least in this country. So actually the Chinese government has stepped in to fill some of those gaps with Confucius Institutes, with funding professorships, with giving scholarships. So it's really like, we're funding our China knowledge that we desperately need is increasingly being funded by China, by the Chinese government. And that is obviously a trend that needs to be reversed. So when people talk about we need to close all the Confucius Institutes, I'm like, my reaction is, in theory, I'm all on board. I think there should be no university that teaches courses that are funded by the Chinese Communist Party or through the Chinese government. But the problem is you can't just close things. You have to make sure that you actually set up alternative funding, that you set up an alternative, because we do desperately need more knowledge about China. So that's really the thing that I'm hoping for, that people will finally get around, our governments will finally get around to investing more in this China knowledge so that we can ensure that it doesn't get funded by the CCP.
So obviously the solution is people need to watch China Uncensored.
I can definitely recommend that people watch China Uncensored. I am a big fan of your show. I watch it regularly. I may or may not always agree, but I do think it's a really good show that has the finger on stuff that is currently happening. So yeah, absolutely endorsement for me.
Well, I appreciate that. And thank you very much for joining and becoming a part of this body of knowledge.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for watching. The book is called Hidden Hand, Exposing How the Chinese Communist Party is Reshaping the World. The publisher is offering a special discount just for China Uncensored fans. Use the promo code UNCENSORED. The link is in the description below. Check it out. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.